Should the world take Putin's nuclear threats seriously?
Nuclear saber-rattling is clearly irresponsible.
To date, the real risk on the nuclear side is zero.
You can't rule out, because he has done things that we wouldn't have predicted he would do.
Last February, on the third day of Vladimir Putin's attack against Ukraine, he went on television with his top generals and made a point of ordering them to place Russia's special nuclear forces on high alert. He has kept up a drumbeat of nuclear threats in the months since. A few weeks ago, Russia released a video that suggested nuclear missiles were being moved into position where they could be used in the Ukraine conflict. Putin often refers to the U.S. nuclear bombs dropped on Japan in 1945, and his message is clear. If the Americans can do it, then so can I.
США единственная страна в мире, дважды применившая ядерное оружие, уничтожив японские города Хиросиму и Нагасаки. Кстати говоря, создали прецедент.
Of course, nuclear bombs have become hundreds of times more powerful than those dropped on Japan and could literally destroy the world. But Putin seems to have thought of that too. He gave this absolutely chilling interview back in 2018.
Для мира будет глобальная катастрофа. Но я все-таки как гражданин России и глава российского государства, тогда хочу задаться вопросом, а зачем нам такой мир, если там не будет России?
A few months later, he even sounded like some sort of religious suicide bomber.
И, ну что ж, а мы жертвы агрессии. И мы как мученики попадем в рай. А они просто сдохнут. Потому что они даже раскаяться не успеют.
Dissident Russian sociologist Greg Utin thinks that Vladimir Putin is capable of using nuclear weapons.
As a last resort, there is no doubt for me that he is prepared to do that once he feels that he runs out of resources. Because once again, this is an existential situation for him. If he loses, he's dead. This is how he sees this situation.
Для защиты России и нашего народа мы, безусловно, используем все имеющиеся в нашем распоряжении средства. Это не блеф.
Putin saying he's not bluffing. I'm not bluffing, he said it.
Well, he wouldn't say I am bluffing, would he?
British nuclear physicist Patricia Lewis is one of the world's foremost experts on nuclear weapons.
Just having made that threat does mean we have to take it seriously. If it were a bomb that were detonated in Ukraine, countries in the surrounding areas, people in the surrounding towns and cities in Ukraine would be told to stay indoors. There would be panic, that's absolutely true. The other thing to be aware of course, is that once you've used nuclear weapons on a battlefield, what you've done to that battlefield is made it uninhabitable for a very long time. And governments are thinking that through. There's no doubt about that. But they have for a long time. That was the scenario during the Cold War.
Chinese President Xi Jinping answered the Putin threats with a firm statement that the international community must jointly oppose the use of, or threats to use, nuclear weapons. In October, Putin tried to pull back a bit, saying he saw no reason to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine. But in December, he went back to his veiled threats.
Slava Ukraina! Slava Ukraina!
Bob Seeley was a British soldier who has become a Conservative member of Parliament and head of the Ukraine Working Group. He thinks the biggest downside of using a nuclear weapon for Putin is political.
I think he becomes even more isolated and the Chinese abandon him. I mean, I think that's the danger. That I think it's not so much what the West will do, but it's what China will do. It's what non-aligned countries will do. That effectively, if he does use nuclear weapons, he will simply become a larger version of North Korea. And I think it will be a disaster for the Russian state for a generation. I also then think he probably increases his chances of being ousted in a palace coup of some kind.
The general consensus seems to be that if Putin used a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, it would more likely be one of the smaller battlefield nukes that both the US and Russia tested in the 1950s, and not in the decades since.
A nuclear weapon of any size is a huge step change from a conventional weapon. You get all sorts of problems with high winds, high wind velocity, a sucking up of dirt, which creates this sort of mushroom cloud effect. But also you get a prompt radiation, which goes out and affects all life forms in the area, plus enormous heat, which causes fires. There is the risk that there would be fallout that would spread to NATO countries, in which case it could be interpreted as an attack on NATO countries. That is possible. And he needs to take that into account.
I don't think we would respond with a nuclear weapon to their use of a nuclear weapon in Ukraine.
William Taylor served as the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine in the years leading up to the February Russian invasion. He points to the statement on this issue from U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan.
And we have communicated directly, privately, to the Russians at very high levels that there will be catastrophic consequences for Russia if they use nuclear weapons in Ukraine.
I am sure that in his private conversations, in his conversation directly with Russian leaders in the Kremlin, right around Putin, he was more explicit than catastrophic. And he said what it was, what those catastrophic consequences would be. And my bet is, I don't know this, but my bet is those catastrophic consequences would be a conventional attack from the United States and NATO on Russian military targets.
In the days leading up to the February invasion, apparently Putin delivered an odd message to then UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson.
He threatened me at one point and said, Boris, I don't want to hurt you, but with a missile it would only take a minute or something like that, jolly.
Former U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton has suggested that the private U.S. warning to Vladimir Putin should be more dire.
I think NATO should be thinking of what's the maximum deterrent message they could send to Putin, and my suggestion would be a very clear public statement that if Russia uses any nuclear device, Putin has signed his own death warrant.
Is that a realistic threat?
I think it is realistic, and I think if you can think of a stronger deterrent than telling Putin he's going to commit suicide if he does it, I'd be happy to consider that.
British MP Bob Seeley thinks threatening Putin with death would be unwise.
I'm not quite sure how you say that. What does that mean, that you'd flatten Moscow? That's pretty dangerous stuff, isn't it?
John Bolton says the U.S. could target Putin alone.
Well, I wouldn't discuss what we would do, but I have confidence we could do it.
The Americans who doubt Putin would use a nuclear weapon come back to that famous moment last February when Putin publicly ordered his generals to place Russia's nuclear forces on alert.
He didn't put them on alert. Our folks, we talked about the CIA, our intelligence agencies have no higher priority than to keep track of nuclear weapons in Russia. They watch it they know where they are, and they know what it takes to put them on alert, and it didn't happen. It didn't happen. It was saber rattling as a bluff. It was a bluff.
Sometimes this question comes down to an assessment as to whether Putin has become mentally unbalanced enough to use a nuclear weapon. Again, former U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton thinks not.
But I've met with him on a number of occasions. I don't see that there's a mental issue here. In conversations I've had with him, and he does speak English, but where we've reached disagreement on something like arms control, he has said, well, you have your logic, we have our logic, we'll see which one prevails.
So, Terence, there are Putin's words, but those are calculated, calibrated, probably deceptive. All the experts you've spoken with, what kind of situation do they see as likely to cause Putin to actually use nuclear weapons?
Even skeptics like John Bolton worry that if there was a sudden collapse of the Russian army in Ukraine, if it looked like Putin was about to lose power, that would be the moment of maximum nuclear danger. They think the strategy should be to bring the war to a close without triggering regime change in Moscow.
All right, Terence McKenna in Toronto, thank you.